It was one of those quiet afternoons in the neighborhood, the kind where everything felt still, almost too still. The type of day where even the birds seemed to hush, as if they knew something unsettling was about to unfold. Elijah, a 16-year-old who had just moved to this sleepy suburb a few months ago, walked down the street. He was tall for his age, with an easy smile and a knack for making people laugh. Today, though, his smile was absent. He had been feeling uneasy lately, a nagging sense that something wasn't right. Elijah wasn't alone in his unease. Ever since his family moved here, there had been whispers. Not everyone was welcoming. Sure, some neighbors waved, but others stared too long, their eyes saying things their lips never dared. One of those neighbors was Mr. Grayson. An older man who kept mostly to himself, Grayson was the kind of person you felt before you saw. His presence was heavy, his gaze sharp. He never spoke much to Elijah's family, but his silence carried weight, like a storm cloud hanging just overhead. Elijah had always been taught to stay respectful, to brush off the glares and focus on his own path. But it wasn't easy. Grayson's behavior wasn't just cold, it was menacing. He'd catch the man watching him from his porch, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the arms of his rocking chair like he was holding back a world of anger. Elijah wasn't sure why the man disliked him so much, but he knew it was personal. Too personal. That afternoon, Elijah decided to take the long way home from basketball practice. He didn't want to pass Grayson's house, not today. But fate, or maybe something darker, had other plans. Cutting through an alley, Elijah suddenly felt the air shift. A strange sound, a low slithering hiss, made him stop in his tracks. His heart pounded as he turned. But before he could react, a voice boomed behind him. "Well, look who we have here." Elijah froze. It was Grayson. The man's voice was cold, dripping with something Elijah couldn't quite place. Hatred, maybe. He turned to face Grayson, who stood there holding something in his hand. At first, Elijah thought it was just a rope, but then he saw it move. His blood ran cold. It wasn't a rope. It was a snake. Grayson's smile was chilling. His eyes locked onto Elijah, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You think you can just walk through here like you own the place?" he sneered. Elijah's voice caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but fear had taken over. Before he could move, Grayson stepped closer, the snake writhing in his grip. What happened next felt like a blur. Elijah tried to back away, but Grayson was quicker than he looked. In one swift motion, he had Elijah pinned against a pole, the snake slithering ominously as Grayson wrapped it around him. Elijah struggled, his heart racing as he felt the cold, smooth scales of the snake tighten against his skin. "You don't belong here," Grayson hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson." Elijah's mind raced. He thought about his parents, his friends, and the sheer absurdity of the situation. How had things escalated to this? But even in his fear, he refused to cry out. He wouldn't give Grayson the satisfaction. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, something unexpected happened. A voice called out from the distance, multiple voices, familiar voices. Elijah's friends had been looking for him after practice when they noticed he hadn't shown up at their usual spot. They followed the path they knew he'd take and arrived just in time to see what was happening. "Hey, what are you doing?" One of them shouted, their tone filled with anger and disbelief. Grayson turned, startled, his grip on the snake faltering. Elijah's friends weren't just shouting. They were running toward him, their footsteps loud and unrelenting. The group's conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. The sound was sudden and loud, making everyone jump. Marcus was the first to move, peeking through the window to see who it was. His shoulders tensed. "It's Mr. Cooper," he said, stepping back. Elijah's stomach tightened. Mr. Cooper was their next-door neighbor, a middle-aged man who had always been polite but distant. He wasn't the type to just drop by unannounced, especially not in the middle of the evening. Elijah got up and opened the door, forcing a smile. "Hi, Mr. Cooper. Everything okay?" Mr. Cooper nodded, but his expression was serious. "I just wanted to check on you," he said, glancing behind Elijah at the group gathered inside. "I saw some commotion earlier with Grayson. Is everything all right?" Elijah hesitated. He didn't know how much Mr. Cooper had seen, and he wasn't sure how much he should say. But before he could answer, Sarah stepped forward. "No, everything is asterisk, not asterisk, all right," she said, crossing her arms. Grayson attacked Elijah. He tried to scare him with a snake and tied him up to a pole. It was insane. Mr. Cooper's eyes widened. He did asterisk what asterisk? His voice was low, almost disbelieving, but there was an edge to it that made Elijah think he wasn't entirely surprised. "He's been like this since we moved here," Elijah admitted quietly. "Always watching, always glaring. But today was different." He crossed a line. Mr. Cooper sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Grayson's always been difficult," he said carefully. "But this is something else. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Elijah. No one deserves to be treated like that." "Then why does he get away with it?" Sarah shot back. "Why hasn't anyone done anything about him before now?" Mr. Cooper hesitated, his eyes shifting slightly. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Grayson's lived here a long time. Longer than most of us. He's set in his ways, and, well, not everyone in this neighborhood has the backbone to stand up to him." "That's just an excuse," Marcus said bluntly. "If people had done something sooner, maybe this wouldn't have happened." Mr. Cooper looked at Marcus, then at Elijah. "You're right," he admitted. "It is an excuse, but maybe it's time things changed." There was something in his tone that caught Elijah off guard, an undercurrent of determination. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small crack in the wall of indifference that had surrounded Grayson for so long. Maybe not everyone in the neighborhood was okay with what was happening. Maybe there was hope for change. After Mr. Cooper left, the group sat in silence for a while, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The conversation had shifted something, though. It wasn't just about reacting anymore. It was about figuring out how to take control of the situation. As the evening wore on, Elijah's parents came home, and the story spilled out in bits and pieces. His mom's face darkened with anger as she listened, while his dad's expression was more subdued but no less serious. "We're going to handle this," his mom said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Grayson doesn't get to terrorize my son. Not now, not ever." Elijah felt a flicker of relief at her words, but the unease in his chest didn't fully disappear. He couldn't shake the feeling that Grayson wasn't done, that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something more dangerous. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Elijah replayed the day's events over and over in his mind. He thought about Grayson's face, the way it twisted with hatred. He thought about Mr. Cooper's words, the quiet acknowledgement that the neighborhood had let this go on for too long. And he thought about his friends, about how they'd stood by him without hesitation. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let fear control him. Grayson might have tried to make him feel small, powerless, but Elijah wasn't alone. And as long as he had his friends, his family, and his own determination, he knew he could face whatever came next. The battle wasn't over. In some ways, it was just beginning. The next morning, Elijah woke up to an uneasy quiet, the kind that made everything feel heavier than it was. The sun streamed through the blinds, but it didn't bring its usual warmth. Instead, it felt like the day itself was holding its breath. As he got ready for school, he tried to shake the tension building in his chest, but it clung to him like a shadow. As they debated their next move, the group's bond became even more apparent. Each of them had their own perspective. Marcus wanted to confront Grayson again. Sarah insisted on calling the police, and Chloe suggested talking to Elijah's parents first. But despite their different approaches, their shared goal was clear: to make sure Elijah was safe, and that Grayson faced consequences for what he'd done. In the background, the sky began to darken, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street. The neighborhood felt eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Grayson might have retreated for now, but his hatred wasn't something that could be easily erased. It was a poison that had been building for years, and it had finally boiled over. The question that lingered in Elijah's mind was why. Why did Grayson hate him so much? Was it really just because he and his family were different? Or was there something deeper, something hidden in Grayson's past that fueled his actions? Elijah didn't have answers, but he knew one thing for sure. This was a turning point. Grayson's actions had crossed a line, and the community wouldn't be able to ignore it. Whether they rallied behind Elijah or tried to sweep it under the rug remained to be seen. But Elijah and his friends weren't going to let this slide quietly. They were determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. As the group started walking back toward Elijah's house, their conversation shifted. They talked about their next steps, about how to protect Elijah and hold Grayson accountable. But beneath their words was an unspoken understanding. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about standing up against something bigger, something that had been simmering in their town for far too long. Elijah glanced over his shoulder as they walked, half expecting to see Grayson lurking in the shadows, but the street was empty. For now, at least, the dangers seemed to have passed. But deep down, Elijah knew this was just the beginning. Grayson wasn't the type to back down easily, and neither were they. The tension hung heavy in the air as they approached Elijah's house, their voices hushed but determined. Each step felt like a declaration, a promise that they wouldn't let fear or hatred win. And as they crossed the threshold into the safety of Elijah's home, one thing was clear: the fight was far from over. Back at Elijah's house, the group settled into the living room. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind of silence where everyone was thinking, but no one knew quite what to say. Elijah sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. His mom was still at work, and his dad was running errands, which meant the house was empty except for the group. That felt safer, somehow, like there was space to breathe and figure things out before his parents had to be brought into it. Sarah paced back and forth, her phone still in her hand. "I'm telling you, we need to call the police," she said, her voice sharp. "This isn't just some creepy old man being weird. What he did was dangerous, Elijah. It's a crime." Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And what happens if they don't take it seriously? You know how this goes sometimes. They might just write it off like it's nothing. Or worse," Chloe added quietly. "What if they say it's Elijah's fault? That he provoked Grayson or something?" Her voice faltered, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Elijah stayed quiet, his mind spinning. He didn't want to think about what might happen if they called the police. He'd seen enough stories, too many, really, where things didn't go the way they should. People like Grayson didn't always face the consequences they deserved, and Elijah wasn't sure if he could handle that kind of frustration. Jordan, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "Maybe we start with your parents," he suggested. "They'll know what to do. And if we all explain what happened, it'll be harder for anyone to twist the story." Elijah nodded slowly. It was a good idea. His parents were practical, and his mom especially didn't play around when it came to protecting her family. But part of him still felt hesitant. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family, about how the neighborhood would look at them after this. Would people support them, or would it just make them even bigger targets? In that moment, something shifted. Grayson's smug confidence melted away, replaced by panic. He looked around, realizing he was outnumbered. The predator was suddenly the prey. Elijah could see it in his eyes, the fear, the realization that he'd gone too far. But what would his friends do? And what would happen to Grayson now that the tables had turned? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Grayson stood frozen, his eyes darting between Elijah's friends and the makeshift scene he had created. The snake, now partially unwound from Elijah, seemed just as unsettled as everyone else. Elijah's heart was still racing, his body tense against the cold metal of the pole, but there was a flicker of relief in his chest. His friends were here, and they weren't backing down. "Let him go now." Marcus, the tallest and most outspoken of the group, barked as he closed the distance. Marcus wasn't just Elijah's teammate, he was practically family. They'd grown up playing basketball together, always watching each other's backs. And right now, Marcus was doing what he did best, protecting his own. Grayson's face twisted, his bravado slipping further. "This isn't your business," he snapped, his voice shaking slightly. But his words didn't carry the same weight as before. "It's everyone's business when you mess with one of us," said Sarah, her voice steady and sharp. She wasn't just there for backup. She was there to make it clear that this wasn't going to slide. Her piercing gaze didn't leave Grayson for a second. Elijah's other friends, Jordan, Malik, and Chloe, formed a semicircle, their presence a wall of defiance. It was clear Grayson wasn't expecting this. He probably assumed no one would come looking for Elijah, that his actions would go unnoticed. But he'd underestimated the bond this group shared. Grayson hesitated, the snake now dangling awkwardly in his hands. He was trespassing, he mumbled, trying to justify himself, but the excuse was weak, even to his own ears. "Trespassing. He lives here." Chloe fired back, her voice trembling with anger. "What's wrong with you?" Elijah's chest heaved as he caught his breath, finally finding his voice. "I wasn't doing anything to you," he said, his words steady despite the fear still lingering in his system. "Why do you hate me so much?" Grayson didn't answer, his face tightening instead. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might lash out again, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The group wasn't just a group of kids. They were witnesses to something he couldn't explain away. The scene hung in tense silence, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Elijah's friends weren't just standing there. They were ready to act if Grayson made another move. And he knew it. The tables had turned entirely, and the power he thought he held was slipping through his fingers. As Grayson began to back away, still clutching the snake, Elijah's mind raced through the events of the past few months. This wasn't the first time Grayson had made him feel unwelcome, though it was by far the most extreme. There had been the stares, the muttered comments, and the way Grayson always seemed to be watching. It wasn't just about Elijah, it was about what he represented. Moving to this neighborhood had been a big deal for Elijah's family. They'd worked hard to leave their old apartment in the city, trading it for a house with a yard and the promise of a quieter life. But not everyone in the community saw them as neighbors. For some, they were outsiders, and Grayson made it clear he thought they didn't belong. Marcus broke the silence, his voice steady but filled with authority. "You need to leave. Now." Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. He wasn't in control anymore, and he knew it. Slowly, he turned and started to walk away, a snake still clutched in his hands like some bizarre trophy. The group watched him until he disappeared around the corner, and only then did they turn their attention back to Elijah. "You okay, man?" Marcus asked, stepping closer. Elijah nodded, though his legs still felt shaky. "Yeah, I think so." His voice was hoarse, the adrenaline starting to wear off. Sarah pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. "We need to tell someone about this," she said. "He can't get away with it." Elijah hesitated. Part of him wanted to let it go, to avoid making things worse. But another part of him knew Sarah was right. This wasn't just about him. If Grayson was willing to do something like this, who's to say he wouldn't target someone else? When he came downstairs, his mom was already on the phone, her voice sharp and determined. Elijah caught bits and pieces of the conversation. Words like incident, unacceptable, unaction. She hung up with a sigh, giving him a tight smile. "That was the school," she explained. "I wanted to make sure they were aware of what happened, just in case Grayson tries anything there. Don't worry, baby. We're not letting him scare you." Elijah nodded, grateful for her strength, but it didn't make the knot in his stomach go away. He grabbed his bag and headed out, meeting Marcus and Sarah at the corner. They were already talking, their voices low but urgent. "We're doing it tonight," Sarah said as Elijah approached. "Doing what?" Elijah asked, his brow furrowed. "We're going back to Grayson's house," Marcus said, dancing around to make sure no one was listening. "We need to figure out why he's so fixated on you. There's got to be something." If we can find proof that he's done this to other people, it'll make it harder for anyone to ignore. Elijah stopped walking, the weight of their words sinking in. You want to break into his house? He asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and concern. Not break in, Sarah said quickly. Just look around. His backyard is practically a junkyard. There's no way anyone could tell if we were there or not, and it's not like we're going to steal anything. We just want to know what we're dealing with. Elijah hesitated. The idea made his pulse quicken, but not in a good way. What if he catches us? What if? He won't, Marcus interrupted. The guy's always gone by 8, probably to harass someone else. We'll be in and out before he even knows we were there. Chloe and Jordan joined them a few minutes later, and the group spent the rest of the day quietly planning. Elijah felt torn. Part of him wanted to back out, to tell them it wasn't worth the risk. But another part of him, the part that was tired of living in fear, knew they were right. If they didn't do something, Grayson would keep getting away with it. That evening, the 5 of them met up near the edge of the neighborhood, just out of sight of Grayson's house. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. Elijah's heart pounded as he scanned the area, half expecting Grayson to appear out of nowhere. You sure about this? Chloe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Elijah admitted, but I'm tired of being scared. Marcus nodded, clapping a hand on his shoulder. We've got your back, man. Always. They moved quickly, keeping to the edges of the yards and sticking to the shadows. When they reached Grayson's property, Elijah felt his breath catch. The place looked even more intimidating up close. The backyard was a mess of rusted metal, old furniture, and other random debris, all piled haphazardly. Stay low, Marcus whispered, leading the way through a gap in the fence. As they crept through the yard, Elijah's nerves were on high alert. Every creak of a board or crunch of leaves beneath their feet felt deafening. But they pushed forward, their determination stronger than their fear. Sarah stopped near a shed, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Over here, she said softly. The shed door was slightly ajar. Inside was a collection of strange items. Old photographs, jars filled with who knew what, and stacks of yellowed papers. Sarah and Chloe sifted through the papers, while Marcus and Jordan searched the rest of the yard. Elijah stayed near the edge of the property, his eyes scanning for any sign of Grayson. The longer they stayed, the more uneasy he felt. It wasn't just the fear of getting caught. There was something about being here, in Grayson's space, that felt wrong. Like the air itself was heavier. Elijah, Sarah called, her voice urgent but quiet. He turned and hurried over to her, his stomach twisting at the look on her face. She held up a photo, her hands trembling. It was a picture of a group of kids, maybe from years ago. But one face stood out. A young boy who looked eerily similar to Elijah. What is this? Elijah asked, his voice barely audible. I don't know, Sarah said. But it's definitely him. She pointed to Grayson, younger but unmistakable, standing off to the side in the photo. His expression was the same as it was now. Cold, hard, and unwelcoming. Before Elijah could process what he was seeing, Marcus appeared from the other side of the yard. We need to go, he said urgently. Now. What happened? Chloe asked. He's coming, Marcus said, his voice tense. I saw his truck turn the corner. We have maybe 2 minutes. Panic set in as the group scrambled to put everything back the way they found it. Elijah's heart raced as they slipped through the gap in the fence, his mind spinning with questions. Why did Grayson have a photo of someone who looked like him? What did it mean? They didn't stop running until they were several blocks away, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Elijah leaned against a tree, clutching the photo Sarah had shoved into his hands. What now? Jordan asked, his voice shaky. Elijah stared at the picture, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and dread. I don't know, he said finally, but whatever this is, it's bigger than we thought. The group fell silent, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The photo felt like a piece of a puzzle they didn't know how to solve. and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. Elijah looked up at his friends, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. They were tired, scared, but determined. And so was he. Grayson might have been the one with secrets, but Elijah wasn't going to stop until he uncovered them. Whatever it took, he was ready to face it. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The group stood huddled beneath the dim streetlight, their breaths still uneven from the frantic run. Elijah clutched the photograph tightly, its edges curling slightly in his trembling hands. The eerie resemblance between the boy in the picture and himself was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just that they looked alike. It was the way the boy stood, the same guarded expression that Elijah recognized in his own reflection. "We need to figure out who this kid is," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, but the fear lingering in her eyes betrayed her. If Grayson kept this photo, there has to be a reason. Maybe it's connected to why he's targeting you. Chloe nodded, hugging her arms around herself. But how do we even start? We don't know who any of these people are, and it's not like we can ask Grayson. "Maybe we don't need to," Marcus said suddenly, his eyes narrowing as if a plan was forming. "If Grayson's been here forever, someone in the neighborhood might know. There's got to be someone who remembers this group of kids." Elijah hesitated. The idea of asking neighbors felt risky. What if word got back to Grayson? But before he could voice his concerns, Jordan spoke up. "That's Mrs. Thompson," he suggested. "She's lived here longer than anyone. If this photo is from around here, she might recognize the people in it." The group exchanged uncertain glances before Elijah finally nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll ask her. But we need to be careful. If Grayson finds out we're digging into his past..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken threat hung heavily in the air. They made their way to Mrs. Thompson's house, their steps cautious as if Grayson's eyes were on them even now. Mrs. Thompson was known for her warm smile and never-ending stories about the neighborhood's history. If anyone could shed light on the photo, it was her. When they arrived, Elijah knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet night. It took a moment, but eventually the door creaked open, revealing the elderly woman. Her grey hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she wore a knitted cardigan that looked as old as the house itself. "Elijah, dear," she said with a smile. "What brings you here so late?" "We need your help," Elijah said, holding up the photo. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" Mrs. Thompson adjusted her glasses, squinting at the image. Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of something Elijah couldn't quite place, concern, maybe even fear. She handed the photo back quickly, her hands trembling slightly. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Elijah hesitated, but Sarah stepped in. "It was in Grayson's shed," she said. "We think it's important, but we don't know why." Mrs. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced around nervously, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "You shouldn't be messing with Grayson," she said. "That man, he's dangerous." "We know," Elijah said, "but we don't have a choice. He's been targeting me, and we think this photo might explain why." Mrs. Thompson sighed, her shoulders slumping. "The boy in the picture," she said slowly, "his name was Adam. He lived here a long time ago, back when Grayson was about your age." "Adam," Elijah repeated, the name unfamiliar, but oddly heavy. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated again, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He disappeared," she said finally. It was the talk of the neighborhood for years. One day, he was just gone. No one ever figured out what happened to him. The police searched, but they didn't find anything. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah leaned forward. And Grayson, was he involved? Mrs. Thompson looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. "No one could prove it," she said carefully. "But there were rumors. Grayson was troubled even back then. Adam and Grayson had some kind of fight not long before he vanished. After that, people started to keep their distance from Grayson." Elijah's stomach churned. The idea that Grayson might have been connected to a disappearance. and that he had a photo of the boy decades later was almost too much to process. But before he could ask more questions, Mrs. Thompson reached for the photo again, her expression softening. "You look like him," she said quietly, her voice laced with something almost mournful. "Adam, you have the same eyes." The words sent a chill down Elijah's spine. He looked at the photo again, trying to imagine the life of the boy who had gone missing all those years ago. What was the connection? And why was Grayson still holding on to this piece of the past? As they left Mrs. Thompson's house, the group walked in tense silence, the weight of what they'd learned settling over them. When they reached the corner, Marcus finally broke the silence. "If Grayson was involved in Adam's disappearance," he said, "then he's capable of way more than we thought." "And he's still obsessed," Sarah added. "Why else would he keep that picture? He's fixated on Adam." Maybe he sees you as some kind of reminder, Elijah." The thought made Elijah's skin crawl. He couldn't help but wonder if Grayson saw Adam every time he looked at him, and if that was the reason for his hostility. The idea raised more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: they were in deeper than they'd ever imagined. As they reached Elijah's house, Marcus turned to him. "We need to figure out what happened to Adam," he said. "The truth about him might be the key to stopping Grayson." Elijah nodded, but his heart was heavy. The stakes had never been higher, and the path ahead was darker than ever. Whatever they were about to uncover, he knew it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be safe. Elijah barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Adam stared back at him, his expression frozen in time. The weight of Mrs. Thompson's words haunted him. Who was Adam to Grayson? And why did Elijah's resemblance to him seem to set everything in motion? By the time dawn broke, Elijah had made up his mind. He couldn't wait for answers to come to him. He needed to confront Grayson directly, no matter how dangerous it might be. Elijah told his friends about his plan the next morning. They were immediately against it, their concern for his safety outweighing their curiosity. But Elijah was resolute. "This is my fight," he said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside him. "I need to know the truth." Reluctantly, the group agreed to back him up, but only if they could stay close in case things went wrong. They devised a plan to approach Grayson while he was alone and corner him with the photograph. Elijah carried it in his pocket, the edges now worn from being handled so much. It felt like the only weapon he had against the man who had terrorized him for weeks. That evening, they found Grayson in his backyard, tinkering with an old truck. The sound of tools clinking against metal echoed in the still air, and the smell of oil hung heavy. Elijah's pulse quickened as he stepped through the gap in the fence, his friends waiting just out of sight. Grayson glanced up, his eyes narrowing when he saw Elijah. For a moment, he looked surprised, but his expression quickly hardened into the familiar scowl. "You've got guts showing up here," Grayson growled, wiping his hands on a rag. "What do you want?" Elijah pulled the photograph from his pocket and held it out. "I want to know about Adam," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "Why do you have this picture? What happened to him?" Grayson froze, his eyes locked on the photograph, and for the first time Elijah saw something unexpected in his expression. Fear. It was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to unsettle him. "That's none of your business," Grayson snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. He turned away, but Elijah stepped closer, refusing to back down. "It is my business," Elijah shot back. "You've been targeting me because I remind you of him, haven't you? What did Adam do to you? What did you do to him?" Grayson whipped around, his face contorted with anger. "You don't know what we're talking about," he shouted. "Adam he was trouble. Just like you." Elijah's chest tightened, but he stood his ground. "If he was trouble, why do you still have this picture? Why do you care so much?" Grayson didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered to the photograph again, and his shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of it all was finally too much. "He was my brother," Grayson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah's breath caught. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. Adam wasn't just some kid from the neighborhood, he was Grayson's family. The resemblance suddenly made sense, but it also raised more questions. What happened to him? Elijah asked, his voice softer now. Grayson's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, his anger melting into something closer to sorrow. He ran away, he said. We had a fight, and he took off. I thought he'd come back, but he never did. The police said he probably left town. But I don't know. Part of me thinks something happened to him, and it was my fault. The admission hung in the air, heavy and raw. Elijah didn't know what to say. Grayson's hostility, his obsession, it all stemmed from guilt. He saw Elijah as a reminder of the brother he'd lost, a reflection of the boy he pushed away. Before Elijah could respond, a loud rustling came from the far side of the yard. Both he and Grayson turned toward the noise, their hearts pounding. Marcus, Sarah, and the others stepped into view, their faces pale with worry. Elijah, Sarah called. We need to go. Now. What's wrong? Elijah asked, his voice filled with alarm. It's not safe, Marcus said, glancing nervously at Grayson. We found something in the woods behind your house. Grayson's head snapped toward them. The woods? He asked sharply. What were you doing out there? Elijah's blood ran cold. What did you find? Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to Grayson. There's an old campsite, she said finally. It looks like someone lived there for a long time. Grayson's face went pale, and he took a step toward them. Show me, he demanded. Despite their unease, the group led Grayson to the spot. The woods were thick and overgrown, but after several minutes, they reached the clearing. The remnants of a campsite were scattered across the ground. An old tent, rusted cookware, and a pile of decayed belongings. Among them was something that made Elijah's stomach churn. A faded journal with Adam scrawled on the cover. Grayson picked up the journal with trembling hands, flipping through the pages. The entries were fragmented, but they painted a picture of a boy who felt abandoned and lost, trying to survive on his own. The final entry was a plea for help, written in shaky handwriting. I waited for you, it read, but you never came. Grayson sank to his knees, clutching the journal to his chest. For the first time, Elijah saw the man not as a bully, but as someone broken by grief and regret. The tension between them dissolved, replaced by a somber understanding. As they left the woods, Elijah felt a strange sense of closure. The truth about Adam had finally come to light, and while it didn't excuse Grayson's actions, it gave Elijah the strength to move forward. But just as they reached the edge of the trees, something caught his eye. A faint glimmer of light deeper in the forest, as if someone was watching. He turned to look, but the light disappeared. A chill ran down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't quite over. The walk back from the woods was heavy with silence. Grayson trailed behind the group, the journal still clutched in his hands, his face pale and distant. Elijah glanced at him occasionally, unsure of what to say. For all the anger and fear that Grayson had caused, seeing him so broken now made it hard to hold on to those feelings. There was a sadness about him, a man weighed down by years of regret and guilt. When they reached the edge of the neighborhood, Grayson finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady. I didn't know, he said, addressing no one in particular. I thought he'd left for good. If I'd known he was out there, I would have. I should have done more. The group exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond. Finally, Sarah stepped forward. It's not too late to do something, she said gently. You can honor his memory by making things right, starting with how you treat the people around you. Grayson looked at her, his eyes glassy. He didn't reply, but the weight of her words seemed to sink in. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of his yard. Elijah watched him go, a strange mix of relief and sympathy swirling in his chest. It felt like the end of something, that he wasn't sure if it was the kind of ending that brought peace or just left more questions. Back at Elijah's house, the group gathered in the living room, the tension of the night still hanging over them. Chloe broke the silence first, her voice trembling slightly. Do you think he'll change? Grayson, I mean. Elijah sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think tonight shook him." "Maybe. It's a start." Marcus nodded, his arms crossed tightly. He's been carrying that guilt for so long. It's no wonder he's like this. "Doesn't excuse what he did to you, though." "It doesn't," Sarah agreed. "But maybe now he can finally start to heal. And maybe we can too." For the first time in what felt like weeks, Elijah felt a small flicker of hope. The truth about Adam had been haunting Grayson for decades, twisting him into someone bitter and angry. Now that the truth was out, maybe it would loosen the grip the past had on him, and on the neighborhood as a whole. The days that followed were quieter. Grayson kept to himself, and the tension that had always seemed to radiate from his house began to fade. Elijah caught glimpses of him now and then, working on his truck or sitting on his porch with a journal in his lap. He didn't look angry anymore, just tired. Elijah's friends stayed close, checking in on him regularly. They spent more time together than ever, their bond strengthened by what they'd been through. The experience had changed all of them in ways they were still figuring out. For Elijah, it was a reminder of how much he could rely on the people who cared about him, even when things seemed impossible. One afternoon, about a week after their confrontation in the woods, Elijah found a small envelope on his porch. Inside was the photograph of Adam, along with a note in Grayson's shaky handwriting. "Thank you for helping you remember him. I'm sorry for everything." Elijah stared at the note for a long time, his emotions tangled. He wasn't sure if forgiveness was something he could give just yet, but the gesture felt significant. It was a step forward, however small. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle back into a rhythm. The group spent their evenings hanging out at Sarah's house or exploring parts of the town they'd never thought to visit before. They'd even started working on a small community project inspired by Mrs. Thompson's stories about the neighborhood's history. It felt good to build something positive to focus on moving forward. One night, as they sat around a campfire in Marcus' backyard, Chloe brought up the campsite in the woods. "Do you think someone was really watching us that night?" she asked, her voice quiet. Elijah hesitated, the memory of that faint glimmer of light still fresh in his mind. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe it was just my imagination. Or maybe, I don't know. Maybe it was Adam," Sarah said softly, her gaze fixed on the flames, watching over us. The thought sent a shiver down Elijah's spine, but it wasn't entirely unwelcome. If Adam's spirit was still out there, maybe he finally found some kind of peace. Maybe he'd seen how his story had brought people together, even after so many years. As the fire crackled and the stars stretched endlessly above them, Elijah felt a sense of closure. The past had cast a long shadow over him, but now he could see the light breaking through. Grayson might never fully redeem himself, and the mystery of Adam's final days might never be completely solved, but Elijah knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone. And that was enough. When the fire burned low, and the group began to drift off, Elijah stayed behind for a moment, staring into the embers. He pulled the photograph of Adam from his pocket, the edges now smooth from being handled so much. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying a weight he couldn't quite explain. As he tucked the photo back into his pocket and walked inside, he felt something shift within him. A sense of freedom, of finally letting go. The past would always be there, but it didn't have to define him. And as he climbed into bed that night, he slept peacefully for the first time in what felt like forever.